Welcome, everyone. Happy 2025. I'm so glad to have you here this evening. I know I've got many familiar faces, but some that I don't know. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Jill Ferris. I'm the Vice President of Education and Interpretation here at CBMM, and I am thrilled to have you join us this evening. I love winter, not because I'm from Buffalo and miss the snow for like a microsecond, but because winter is speaker season. And we have a bunch of talks coming up in the next few weeks. So I'm hoping that you will come and join us. We've got a very full schedule. We have things on the website through March, and I will have programming for April and May coming soon. A few highlights. On Saturday, January 25th at 3 p.m., David Gendel will share the last days of the schooner America, a lost icon at the Annapolis Warship Factory. Then on Thursday, January 30th, we're going to get a little weird. Local historian Eric Chisholm is here to dive into the cultural history of Chessie the sea monster. Pushing into February and March, we will have Beyond 2025, What is Next for the Chesapeake Bay Watershed, which is on Thursday, February 6th. On Thursday, February 20th, Unpacking History, Black Packing House Workers and Owners in the Chesapeake with Pete Lesher, our chief historian. And in March, the return of a fan favorite, on Thursday, March 27th, we'll be hosting Waterman's Story Swap again. That one filled up, and I think I pushed like 35 people online last year. So if you're interested in coming, if I can make a recommendation, sign up now. This evening, I'm thrilled to kick off our 2025 season with Salisbury University Assistant Professor of Physiology, Noah Bressman. Through his lab at Salisbury, Bressman and his students study blue catfish and northern snakehead to learn the best ways to manage their populations while also supporting initiatives to encourage people to catch, kill, or eat these invasive fish to keep their populations down. Aquatic invasive species like snakehead and blue cat pose an existential threat to the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem and ways of life associated with it, such as crabbing and fishing. This evening, Dr. Bressman will share some of his research to help inform our understanding of how these species are impacting the Bay. And I will also add a plug of saying that I had the privilege of hearing Dr. Bressman speak at a conference last year, and you are in for a treat. Dr. Bressman earned his Bachelor's of Science in Biology with a concentration in marine biology from Cornell University, a PhD in biology at Wake Forest, and was a postdoctoral research fellow in Dr. Doug Fudge's lab at Chapman University, studying the biomechanical properties of hagfish slime to see how they could be used to help people, such as safely and sustainably stopping boat propellers at high speeds. His research is highly interdisciplinary and collaborative. He's working with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, and the USGS to investigate the health, biology, and ecology of recreational, important, and invasive fish species such as blue catfish and northern snakehead. In addition to being a scientist, Dr. Bressman is an avid science communicator, using biological art as a tool for science communication, creating TED Ed lessons, and writing scientific blogs for a variety of journals, scientific societies, and shows. Without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Noah.
Thank you for the introduction, Jill. So I'm going to talk to you about fish today. But first, I want to acknowledge everybody that made all the work possible, that contributed to this, particularly collaborators at the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, the Delaware DN Rec, USGS, UMCs, UMES, and in particular, I want to highlight all the undergraduate and graduate students that made this possible. This isn't just my research. They probably do more of the actual manpower of the research than I do anyway, now that I'm all doing paperwork and whatnot all day long, and they're doing the fun stuff. But I'm going to share kind of a variety of different things that my lab's got going on, some perspectives I've got. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got to where I am a little bit. I'm an avid angler. I've always loved fish growing up. Inexplicable passion for fish, age of very early. I remember my first grade book report or second grade book report, everybody was doing things like Captain Underpants, and I did mine on the Audubon's First Field Guide to Fish, where I stood up in front of the class and listed several different species of fish and pictures of fish and why I liked those individual fish in particular. And so I grew up fishing a lot too. I picked that up independently. Not really, nobody in my family really fished. I just picked it up independently. But I like the adventure of trying to catch every single species of fish out there. And so I've caught 455 different species. Let's see, we got some snakeheads right there. Do I have a blue catfish there? No. Here's I was in the center page of Saltwater Sportsman with a giant striped bass. Some fun ones. I won a fishing tournament with that snook, 150-pound bluefin tuna, some tuna on the fly, northern pike that I caught, that won an ice fishing tournament. It was also my first time ever ice fishing, which is a fun one, and some other fun fishes, both big and small, like these little fish. This is currently on my wish list of fish, and if you could help me catch one of these fish, I'd love to chat with you afterwards to get me to number 456. Some of these are doable just because I haven't happened to catch a counter right. If I sink some baits out there, eventually I'll get one. But I mean, hey, anybody need an extra person on their boat for White Marlin Open? Let me know. So I also want to start off, kind of mention my passion for fish started early on. I'm going to read you, I think this was a either third or fourth grade assignment that I wrote, and the feedback from the teacher. So I got to kind of position. So my favorite vacation is Martha's Vineyard. I went all over town. My favorite part was when I went fishing. The fish I caught were a bonito to bluefish. My handwriting was and still is bad. Thresher shark, scup, flounder, and blackfish. I went swimming a lot at pools in the ocean. I went to a lot of stores and restaurants. Every day I went fishing and to the beach. The favorite thing I did was when I caught a thresher shark. Teacher commented, concluding sentence, question mark. First off, I caught a thresher shark is a concluding sentence. Second, the feedback that said, Noah, I get the feeling that you like fish and fishing. I'm very happy that you have a hobby and interest. However, you need to write about different topics, no more fish stories. Let's talk about handing in neater papers. See me. And so I took her advice and I never studied fish again. And thank you for my time. Anyway, as you can see, I'm still writing about fish. Also, this is what was it, September 11th. So this was like a couple weeks in, if not the second week of classes. She was already fed up with me talking about fish. So I guess I talked about fish a lot. So anyway, I'm going to talk more about fish now. I'm going to talk a little bit, just kind of give you a little intro of my background, just kind of show you where I'm coming from, because I come at invasive species in a not typical way. I don't come at like your typical people with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources or people who are classically in fisheries and fisheries management and conservation. I came at it with the curiosity of I just really like fish, and I take like an ADHD approach to my research because I have ADHD, but I focus on whatever is interesting to me at the time on fish. There's so much cool stuff out there. I wish I could study it all, and so I use the opportunities available to study fish, and that led to a weird route to get to where I am doing invasive species. To start off, I did my undergraduate degree at Cornell University, where I got a degree in marine biology, and I focused there. I originally thought I was going to do some research on like Shark Week stuff, big flashy stuff, sharks jumping out, eating seals, cool stuff, because that's all I thought marine biology was growing up. There wasn't as much depicted on the media other than Shark Week, and so that's what I thought was the option, and it sounded cool. It was really interesting. I ended up meeting some of those people from Shark Week. Some of them are great people. Some of them are awful people, and I don't recommend them. So I'm glad I didn't. I have mixed feelings about not going into that route, but I really enjoy the route I'm doing, and I'm doing some stuff now that I think is probably even cooler than I would have gone in that route. Anyway, while I was at Cornell University, I happened to find a fish in a hallway. Long story short, it was 10 feet away from the nearest fish tank through a door, and it was still alive. And it was a little fish, little mummy chug. You can see I got mummy chugs tattooed on my arm to kind of commemorate this little project. These are life-size fish. You can buy these these are what you get as minnows at local bait shops, and you can get them around here. They're probably not maybe 100, 200 feet away from right here. They live around the shores everywhere in the Chesapeake Bay, all along the Atlantic coast. Anyway, I found them in a hallway. Turns out I figured out that they can move over land and they can breathe air and they can find their way on land using kind of looking for the most reflective surface in their environment, which is interesting because the day after I found that fish in the hallway, I found another fish in the exact same spot in the hallway on the ground, which couldn't have been a coincidence. And I figured out that spot was where the sunlight first shined through the window onto the shiny tile floor. And the fish thought that was a puddle and they moved to it. and they got confused that it wasn't a puddle and just stuck around there until morning came. And luckily, I grabbed them before they could dry out and I put them back. And so that got me hooked on amphibious fishes. And I did a few more projects on amphibious fishes as an undergraduate, and then decided to. I took a quick. Well, I decided to revisit the whole Shark Week thing and met one of those people. Met one of the heroes that you're not supposed to meet because I realized he's not a hero. And then I was like, no, I'm going to stick with the amphibious fish stuff. And so I went to do a PhD on more amphibious fish work at Wake Forest University in Dr. Miriam Ashley Ross's lab. And there I did some more work on some other killifish species that are killifish are the group that includes mummy chugs and top minnows and things like that. And then I kind of branched out like what other fishes are amphibious. And I remember growing up hearing about snakeheads coming onto land, and I'll get to that research a little bit later. So I did some work describing the amphibious behaviors of snakeheads and walking catfish and other amphibious fishes. And it got me thinking that a lot of amphibious fishes are invasive. Northern snakehead, walking catfish, Asian swamp eel, various pleco species, mummy chugs are invasive in Europe. So it got me thinking that maybe there's some correlation here. And I ended up kind of doing a review study and found that invasive, the amphibious fishes are 10 times more likely to establish non-native or invasive populations than fully aquatic fishes. Now, so that's a lot more than your typical fish, more likely. And there's some reasons for that. The amphibiousness is a spectrum that basically you can have some fish that'll just hop out of water for a couple minutes, some that can, like the lungfish that can breathe there and burrow into the mud and stay there for hours, for up to 4 years. And so it's a range on there, but a lot of them can breathe air and tolerate really terrible conditions with like drying up pools where all the waste gets accumulated in there and things like that. And so it makes sense when you got things like betas and guppies at the pet store that are impossible to kill because they can breathe air and survive terrible conditions. It stands to reason that if you bring things like guppies and betas and snakeheads into a pet store, somebody gets them and then somebody releases it out into the environment. If they can breathe air and survive terrible conditions, they'll probably survive wherever they're put. And that's kind of how invasive amphibious fishes are 10 times more likely to be invasive just because they're easy to transport around and bring to new areas, and they're already well equipped to survive in a variety of conditions. And so that's how I got into invasive species a little bit, just kind of understanding why they come onto land, how they move around on land, and where they go on land to try to figure out how they may be able to spread from one body of water over land to another body of water. Now, later on, I'll get to that got me into from invasive amphibious fishes to just invasive fishes like blue catfish just being here on the Eastern Shore. It's a really big issue. And so I couldn't not look at research that. But I'll give you a quick little side note on my project I did during my postdoctoral research fellowship at Chapman University. I was researching, if anybody's familiar with hagfish, they are these eyeless, jawless, boneless, stomachless, very primitive fish that their defense, they live in the bottom of the ocean, and their defense is produce a ton of slime that's got weird properties, and it can swell really fast, and it's got these like spider-like silks in them that make it extra tough. And they use the clog, something bites it like a shark, it'll clog up the gills so the shark can't breathe, and it'll cough and spit out the hagfish. And I was researching on a naval grant to see if hagfish slime or something like hagfish slime or based off hagfish slime, inspired by hagfish slime, it's called in the field of biomimicry. We wanted to see if it could stop boat propellers as a non-lethal weapon at high speeds. And that's all I'm allowed to tell you about that project because it's military weapons research, and otherwise I would have to use a weapon that may or may not exist on you. So we'll get back into invasive species stuff where I was like, that was a fun little side project on the hagfish stuff. But then I started my professor position at Salisbury University, working on snakeheads with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources as part of my PhD. I already had connections here to work on invasive species. And so I was like, let me continue working on invasive species. Makes sense. But to understand invasive species, we got to understand what an invasive species actually is. And to that, first, we got to discuss that native species are ones that are originally from an area. So things like striped bass and Atlantic sturgeon are native species to the Chesapeake Bay. They are native from this area. Nobody had to introduce them to this area. They've always been here, at least they've been here a long, long time, and humans had no part of their intervention. So then you have non-native fish. That just means they're introduced to a new region. If I take a striped bass and bring it to China, that would be a non-native fish over there. It doesn't necessarily have to establish a reproducing population or anything like that. It just can be non-native, means it's not native to that area. They can have little effects, they can have huge effects. Now, invasive means it is not both non-native and it is deemed either economically or ecologically harmful, and there is often a concerted effort to remove them. And those aspects are important because there's a big kind of sociological aspect to invasive species. Some things like, for example, largemouth bass, black crappie, common carp, bluegill, and channel catfish are not native to the eastern shore of Maryland. They're not native to the state of Maryland at all. They have been introduced. They are largemouth bass, black crappie, channel catfish, and bluegill are more native to further southeast and particularly kind of the Mississippi River drainages. And so to be non-native, you don't have to be translocated far away. You just have to be put in an area you are not native to. And so largemouth bass, black crappie, and all these other ones, and common carp are from Eurasia. Europeans have been fishing for them a while. They brought them over there because they like them. People in, let's say, UK liked catching carp over there, so they brought them over here with them, and that's how they got out here. And so these have been here for a long time. And in this area, all of these are generally regarded as naturalized. So they've been here long enough to, like, all these have been here for over 100, if not 200 years. They've had enough time to find a new balance with the local ecosystem. And they either didn't have catastrophic effects on the ecosystem, maybe just minor negative effects, or maybe they did, and it's too late to know now because we didn't have great fisheries records back in, let's say, 1800. And so we may have lost a bunch of native species when those are introduced. We don't really know, but it seems like these didn't really drive the extinction of a ton of different fish, maybe just several fishes locally in certain situations. But anyway, so there's a big distinction between invasive and non-native fish because non-native fish can have benefits to people. Some people like non-native fish. For example, common carp. The people who brought them over weren't trying to be, let's unleash an invasive species on the ecosystem. They're like, we love catching carp, we love eating carp. Nobody really eats it as much nowadays, but they loved eating carp back then, and they brought it over because they saw it as an opportunity. A lot of these were brought over to stock for angling opportunities. A lot of people like catching largemouth bass, channel catfish, all of these. I go fishing for all of these except channel catfish in my own backyard here, over in Salisbury. But people like catching these. They taste good. They feed people. They're fisheries based off of them. Now, we got to distinguish that from invasive species because some places, largemouth bass, for example, is considered just non-native, like in Maryland. In other places, like in out west, they are considered an invasive species where they're not native out west, where they have damage to native trout ecosystems, outcompeting trout, consuming native minnow species, causing extinctions of native minnow species. You'll have things like rainbow trout are native to the west coast, but not the east coast, and they're outcompeting native brook trout and things like that. Now, a lot of people like going fly fishing for rainbow trout, things like that. And so it all depends on the situation, the location, the context. Is there considered to be more harm than good with these species in this location where they are non-native? And if so, is there active efforts to remove them? If there's not active efforts to remove them and people don't consider them, they consider the benefits to be more good than the cons being negative, then those will be generally regarded as just non-native and won't be managed as the way of invasive species. And so that brings me to Chesapeake, blue catfish in the Chesapeake Bay. These were they're native to the Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio rivers, so similar drainages as the largemouth bass and bluegills and black crappie that I mentioned there, and channel catfish. And they were intentionally introduced in the western Chesapeake Bay and a couple of tributaries in Virginia by fisheries managers in the early 70s to provide fishing opportunities. And so they weren't being introduced with the intention, they weren't an accidental introduction like some things like snakeheads and things like that. They were introduced intentionally back when the bay wasn't as lively as it is now, is probably towards a lower point in its health. Fisheries were overfished. There's a decline in striped bass. The rivers were very polluted, mercury everywhere, things like that, that made the fishing not so good in these rivers in Virginia. And back then, fisheries managers with less comprehensive knowledge of invasive species than we do now thought, hey, we have this fish from the south that gets really big. You can see here, they can get up to about 3 times larger than this. They get really big. They have giant mouths, and they can eat they'll eat anything and everything, so they're really easy to catch. They taste good, and anytime you get like a giant fish like this, it's gonna fight hard. Let's put these in these rivers because they could survive pretty much any pollution conditions, and maybe it'll bring something back for people to go fishing for in the river. The problem with and they thought that they thought that it couldn't handle the salinity of the Chesapeake Bay, and that it'd probably just stay in the rivers and not spread around. Unfortunately, they did not do any such testing on salinity, or back then there was a limited understanding. We understand invasive species a lot better than we do now, and we would never do that nowadays without with the knowledge we have now. But it was just assumed like they're a freshwater fish. They probably don't like the salt. We should be good. The problem with putting a fish that is capable of surviving in a wide range of conditions into a new area is that it's capable of surviving in a wide range of conditions. It turned out that it could survive the salinity enough. You're not going to find them out in the Atlantic Ocean, but let's say in like you have a big hurricane, a lot of fresh water comes out. You may find them in the middle of the bay. 2 people have gotten them, but they could tolerate the salinity enough to make it out to the mouths of rivers and kind of go. Let's see, do we have a map of a Chesapeake Bay in here? No, but you can kind of go up those kind of rivers. You can picture the Chesapeake Bay. Kind of got Virginia over here, Western Maryland, Eastern Shore over here. They left those rivers, and then they kind of went from kind of hopped around from river mouth to river mouth, up and around the bay, and took them about an extra 30 or 40 years to get to the Eastern Shore, going up and around. And now they're in every tributary of the Chesapeake Bay. And this is one of my graduate students, Zach, and undergrad, Jeremy, doing some research on blue catfish. Not clicking. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a few of the goals of the catfish research. I'll get to the snakehead stuff in a little bit. But some of the main goals of our projects are to investigate diet composition, trophic interactions, that's kind of understanding where it sits on the food web and things like that. And marine resource use of blue catfish in the Aquatic River on the Eastern Shore to see if they're eating marine resources, being a freshwater fish that's now living in estuaries, things like that. But marine resources, mainly we're interested in blue crabs and threatened river herring and things like that. I mean, Maryland blue crabs, big thing to investigate. I don't know if we'd be legally allowed to be called Maryland if we lacked blue crabs anymore. We also want to determine some blue catfish growth and reproductive rates to figure out how quickly their populations are growing, expanding, kind of your basic fishery stuff. To do this, we did a lot of electrofishing where we go on these boats with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. They have these big booms over here, which basically have these electrodes over here, and they'll have like a trailing electrode over here. And that basically creates a shocking area around the boat. Imagine tasering the water and everything gets stunned in a nearby vicinity. You scoop up the stuff you want, you turn the electricity off, everything else swims away after waking up in a couple seconds from being stunned. You can actually see a catfish kind of floating around there. We've been honing a technique called low frequency electrofishing. We're kind of adjusting the electrical conditions. It actually leads to, it seems to target just the catfish better. So if it's better for all the fish by not stunning things like striped bass as much and other things. It can to an extent, but not nearly. It really targets the catfish. And also that frequency seems to travel really far. So we've been able to, we'll have days where instead of just 10 feet away, catfish floating around, we'll have, let's say 200, 300 feet around in a circle of a boat, catfish coming up, and sometimes it'll be tens of thousands of catfish all around us. Like you go any of the bridges in any of the rivers around here, maybe not the Chop Tank Bridge, but like things like the Route 50 bridge over the Aquatic River, things like that. That's some of our big spots where we shock tens of thousands at a time. And so then we'll scoop up a bunch of catfish with the nets. Once the boats are full, we bring them back, and we would cut them open to see what they're eating. We'd also got some fish from fishing tournaments and trot lines and some trawls, kind of sampled a few different ways to see, kind of explore different catfish in different habitats that may help out. And we even ran some fishing tournaments to where instead of us going out collecting one day, I thought, how about we just get 100 people to go out fishing and bring us all fish at one spot while we have a bunch of volunteers ready to collect some data, instead of us having to go out 100 times individually. And it seemed like it was a good time. People had a good fun. People won some prizes, and people learned about catfish. We showed them exactly what we're doing with this research, and it was a win-win for everybody. And we got to draw attention to these issues. And so, yeah, that was some fun. I'm happy to talk about that more later. But we took some basic data like recording the location, water quality, tide, length, body shape, things like that, weight, sex, number of eggs. If we see eggs, kind of learn basic fisheries information. We remove their stomachs and cut them open to see what they were eating. If you see a blue crab in their stomach, it's pretty clear that one ate a blue crab. Sometimes there'll be some fish that would be not very decomposed, and we'd be able to ID them very readily. Other times they'd be very decomposed, and we'd send DNA samples from them to the USGS's Eastern Ecological Center, and they would provide DNA tests for us to determine the identity of those unidentified, really digested fish. And we also did something called stable isotope analysis to determine where they are on the food web. So stable isotope analysis basically uses the principle of you are what you eat. So if you take tissue samples and chemically analyze them from catfish, and you take tissue samples from pretty much everything else in the river, you could figure out what the chemical signature is most closely, what signatures are most closely related to the catfish, which would indicate what the catfish are primarily eating. There's a lot. That's the really simplified version. I'll go into a little bit more depth on what that means. So basically, if you ever heard of like carbon dating or anything like that, you look at the different ratios of isotopes that exist in matter, and we kind of figure out some of them decay at certain rates, some of them travel up the food chain differently than others, and we can understand those different ratios to learn more about how nutrients are working their way through the food web. So by looking at nitrogen and the isotopes of nitrogen, nitrogen can be used to infer trophic position, meaning how high they are on the food web. If they are more enriched in nitrogen 15, this isotope of nitrogen, that means they're going to sit higher on the food web. If they're lower, then they're going to sit lower on the food web. This technique allows us to sample a lot more than just a single stomach's worth. If a catfish's stomach's empty, we can't really get valuable data on what it's eating. But with this method, we can kind of learn holistically what they are eating throughout their entire lifetime, rather than just a single snapshot into the stomach. So this allows us kind of learn more about the overall patterns than about necessarily a single meal that they may have had right before we killed them. Now, carbon is used to indicate the source of primary production. So whether certain algae in saltwater versus seagrass in saltwater versus algae in freshwater, they all have little different carbon signatures, which can help tell you where the diet items from this catfish are coming from. Helps determine if you have like things coming from the ocean, let's say like blue crabs and things like that, where there may be different plants at the bottom of the food web than in the rivers. And then sulfur is used more explicitly for marine resource use, where marine primary producers, marine plants, have more sulfur in them than freshwater plants. So if the catfish would be more enriched in sulfur, that showed that they will likely, or anything more enriched in sulfur, that means that even if it doesn't eat the algae itself, it eats things that maybe eats herring that eats the algae, then it will be more enriched in sulfur. Everything kind of travels up the food chain like that. So here's what that data comes out to look like. It's a lot going on, and I see the text is a little small in these figures that the software pumps out for us. But I'll just say on the bottom is carbon, and on the x-axis is carbon, and the y-axis is nitrogen. So again, carbon kind of tells you the source of primary production, where the plants and algae are coming from. And the nitrogen shows you how high are they on the food chain. So the higher up they are on the food chain, the further up they're going to be. That right there is blue catfish. So you can see it's pretty high on the food chain. It's right next to largemouth bass, which I think everybody would consider to be a predator. And so largemouth bass are high up there. Something that may be skewing the catfish even lower than the largemouth bass a little bit is the catfish are very omnivorous, and they're kind of generalist. They're what we're called generalist opportunistic omnivores. Omnivores meaning that they'll eat plants and animals. So the plants, eating some plants would lower them down on here. Eating only animals will higher them up here, and somewhere in between would be somewhere in the middle. Opportunistic meaning they will take advantage of whatever's in front of them. And generalist meaning they're not very picky, they'll eat anything. And so they'll eat anything, but there are certain things they'll eat more of based on abundance and based on preference. But they'll pretty much eat anything and everything. I'll kind of highlight a few species out here. So you got largemouth bass here, you got blue catfish here. Let's see, striped bass is right here, so it's a little lower. They've been skewed a little bit because we didn't get tissue samples for many big striped bass. I felt bad having to kill like a 60-inch striped bass filled with eggs or anything like that. So we tried to do some smaller ones, but I think we skewed it a little bit to the smaller size. So we're gonna have to collect some data with appropriate scientific collecting permits to get some tissue samples from some larger individuals. But you can see some other ones like bluegill sunfish, American eel, white perch over here. We got, what is this, blue crab over here, channel catfish, hog chokers, gizzard shad, blueback herring, alewife, and menhaden are down here. So we can see, first off, catfish are at the top of the food chain. They are eating everything and everything below them. And I'll break that down a little bit more specifically in frequencies in a little bit. Not only that, they are somewhere in the middle of let's say gizzard shad as the base, kind of which are the base of the food chain in freshwater ecosystems. They only eat freshwater plankton. And then you have the migratory river herring like alewives, blueback herring, and Atlantic menhaden, which are fully saltwater. So these are kind of saltwater prey items, freshwater prey items, and you can see the blue catfish are somewhere in between. So they're using some of those marine resources. But we could break that down even more. So you can see, again, you have the alewife, Atlantic menhaden, and blueback herring, which all are known for being anadromous. They all go out to sea, at least for a portion of their life, or they're feeding out at sea. And do we have blue crab? No, we don't have blue crab on this one. But you can see they're all over here. We've got things like white perch up here, which you can get them estuaries a little bit, so it makes sense that you get some of them being in estuaries. Bluegill sunfish, it's over here too with white perch, but it's got a wide range. You can see kind of based on these bars, it covers a wide range. Down here, you've got largemouth bass, which are pretty freshwater, and you've got gizzard shad, which are pretty freshwater. And here's where blue catfish are. So they are high. This means that they are consuming more marine resources than things like largemouth bass and bluegill sunfish and white perch. They're not as far up as menhaden and things like that. So they're not only eating marine resources. They're not only eating blue crabs and menhaden, but they are somewhere in between. So they are kind of moving more towards that direction. So they are consuming at least a significant amount of marine resources, perhaps enough to have impacts on the marine ecosystem. Now this is going to show this isotopic niches of catfishes. Basically, what this shows is the more overlap you have between two groups, that means the more likely they are to compete with each other just because they consume the same things based off of those chemical signatures. And so you can see we've got blue catfish over here in the black. And then we have white catfish in the blue over here. Probably should have reversed the blue catfish for that, but oh well. So you can see the white catfish is pretty much completely encompassed by the blue catfish. The white catfish is a native catfish. It's part of a healthy ecosystem. It's a native catfish. And so you can see it's likely to be competed heavily with blue catfish. Now, if there was something like the channel catfish over here, which has got some overlap, but it's got some non-overlap. That suggests there's a range of diet items that that channel catfish could, in theory, shift to more easily than the white catfish. So there are other things they can consume, whereas the white catfish seem to have a narrower diet. So if there was a species of most concern regarding competition, it would be the native white catfish, which are going to struggle to compete for the same food sources with a predator that can get about 10 times larger than they can, and still tolerate the same environmental conditions. But down here you get in the green, you have the brown bullhead. Those are another native catfish species, and those seem to not have overlap. So that's at least good news for the brown bullhead. You don't have to worry about those going away. They don't really seem to be affected by blue cat. They're not going to compete with blue catfish as much. And again, the channel catfish are one of those naturalized species. They're non-native. They've been here around for well over 100 years, if not 200 years. So they didn't seem to have as big of effects on the ecosystem, where you're not catching as many white catfish as blue catfish. So they kind of are more of a benign presence in the rivers, whereas the blue catfish in some of these ecosystems make up 70% of the fish biomass in these rivers. What that means is if you were to take all of the fish out with a net and weigh them, 70% by weight in some of these rivers are blue catfish, at least in some stretches. That's not good. That means everything else, 30% is filled by everything else. And that includes those non-native fishes like channel catfish, largemouth bass, snakeheads, and all those other ones, leaving less room for native fish. So they're obviously going to be significant competitors to their native fishes, but they're also going to be significantly consuming so many different prey items that both things like blue crabs that may directly impact blue crab populations, but also may compete by competing for, let's say, blue crabs that striped bass also like to eat. It may reduce the populations of their competitors just because they may outnumber the striped bass in these rivers. They do outnumber the striped bass in these rivers. And to kind of confirm all our suspicions with the diet items, these were, so I would say these three, white perch, blueback herring, we can lump them in with alewives too. They're both migratory herring. Blue crabs and gizzard shad were the top 4 most abundant prey items that we found in their stomachs. So a significant portion of the diet are white perch, blueback herring, and blue crabs. Raise your hand if you like to eat white perch or go white perch fishing. A few of you. Raise your hand if you've ever eaten a blue crab or you like eating blue crab. Yeah, so you can see how this could be problematic for Maryland and why we're doing this research. This was kind of a bad sign. I mean, they're opportunistic generalists, so we knew they're going to eat a lot of different things, and we're hoping they wouldn't prefer blue crabs or things like that. But blue crabs, nonetheless, make up a large percentage of their diet, along with these other items. Striped bass, we didn't see that they. We saw some in their stomach, as you could see. We estimate this to be a 19-inch striped bass in the stomach of a 30-inch blue catfish, showing you that they are not just muddy bottom feeders like people may say, like, oh, a muddy bottom feeder eating up scum makes them taste bad. No, they are an active predator eating things that we like to eat, which also makes them tasty. So they taste a lot better than your typical catfish. I'll get to that a little bit more later. But as you can see, they're a problem for all these species. Based off of stable isotope analysis too, we saw something weird where we saw the small catfish were highly enriched in nitrogen relative to typical fish you'd expect of the size. Meaning the small catfish essentially had the signature of an apex predator, which is unusual because they are like this big and they're probably not eating whole blue crabs or anything like that. So that got us thinking, and we have some preliminary evidence to suggest that the small blue catfish are also a problem because they are eating the eggs of things like striped bass, river herring, and white perch. And so the eggs would have a similar isotopic signature as the parents, just because the parents made the eggs. And so we also confirmed this with some observations from our collaborators at the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, where they found one guy was collecting one time during striped bass spawning to collect catfish, and notice every single catfish he had was overflowing with eggs coming out of the stomach, coming out of the mouth. And so combining our isotopic data with some of the direct observations of that happening seems to suggest that the blue catfish may be a significant factor in the terrible recruitment year after year after year after year after year after year after year of striped bass in the Chesapeake Bay. which is problematic for the future of the state fish of Maryland. And so my lab is going to continue working on that, trying to figure out what's going on with that. But one of the most surprising items we found in the stomach too was a wood duck, an adult wood duck. And so they may influence the ecosystem in ways we are not quite sure yet. We only found one in our study, but I've since had fishermen and watermen be like, "Oh, I cut one open and had 2 gulls in its stomach, or it had a beaver or a muskrat, or it had turtles." We found 2 with turtles in the study, and so we work with a waterman who keeps them in these large tanks, and he'll catch them and keep them live there to sell them to the market and keep them fresh. And he'll always send me photos of the crazy stuff, like this one had 3 muskrats in its stomach, or this one had like 3 ducks in its stomach, and things like that. But we can only use what we had officially in our study based off our kind of keep everything controlled, but we acknowledge some of those other things in the study we're working on. But this was the second fish we cut open in the study. The first one being that 52 pounder I showed you in that first slide. This one was 47 pounds. And so this was a nice, fun surprise. Right when we got started with this project, we knew we were going to have an interesting project on our hands. We were finding ducks in the stomach of catfish. And we didn't see any bird shot or anything like that in there to suggest maybe it was a bird that got shot and lost. I like to imagine it kind of Jaws style. A duck maybe hops off a log. You have a catfish hide under a log, comes up at the water, grabs it, pulls it down, drags it, and eats it. But again, they are opportunistic predators that'll take advantage of whatever prey is in front of them. So some future directions we're going to do with this is to finish the growth rate, get more data on growth rates, and we're developing a new method to more accurately and efficiently and more cost effectively age catfish, and finish the reproduction rate study, kind of learn more about how much they reproduce. And we got enough preliminary data, but it's hard for us to find these really large catfish with their eggs intact, just because those ones don't seem to bite as much when they are in spawning mode, when they have their eggs. But we're gonna work on learning more about that. And we want to investigate methods for reducing blue catfish impacts. I have a new graduate student that's taking the lead on that, Liam Hanley. He's doing a good job with that. And starting next summer, we're going to do a year-long project on the Choptank River, where we're going to do very regular electrofishing, targeting larger catfish, particularly catfish over about 28 inches or so, 30 inches or so. And we're targeting larger catfish because, as I told you, there'd be tens of thousands of catfish we have to scoop up in a day. We don't have enough space on our boat to do that at a time, and limited resources for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and us. We have to be smart with the resources we are using. And so we wanted to see if we specifically fill the boat up with those larger catfish. Can we, again, do that regularly over a year? Can we reduce the population down? First, can we reduce the overall size of the population? But can we reduce the average size of the individual? If we remove a lot of the larger individuals, the ones that could eat those large striped bass, blue crabs, and wood ducks, then they may be just left with smaller ones that may not be able to eat as much and may have less impacts on the ecosystem. Not only that, like with many fish, a larger fish can produce a disproportionate amount of eggs relative to their body size. And so the larger they get, the more eggs they can produce. And so if we get rid of those larger individuals, maybe reduce the spawning success of them, kind of reducing the overall reproductive output of the population. And hopefully we'll see smaller population sizes and smaller individual sizes after the study, kind of learn the best ways to get rid of them. And we're also going to do a study with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources starting the following summer. So not this summer. This summer is this study. Next summer is this study. And we're going to look more directly to see, kind of conclusively tie the striped bass decline, or at least part of striped bass decline. There's a lot of other factors that could be at play, that probably are at play, but try to directly show that blue catfish are having a negative impact by eating striped bass eggs, as well as looking into threatened mussels that are of concern in the rivers in the Upper Bay and around the Susquehanna River Flats, Susquehanna River, and some of those other rivers up there, like Severn and whatnot. I guess up there now. I guess we're gonna everything north of the bridge, so we're not gonna include over here. So now I'm gonna shift gears a little bit into Northern Snakehead. I'm going to talk a little bit about that work I did in grad school and some of the work that my lab is currently doing. So snakeheads are native to stagnant waters in Southeast Asia, where they're used to kind of rainy and dry season, a series of floods and monsoons versus droughts kind of in between. But flooding could perhaps strand them on land, and as the water recedes, they may need to have developed an adaptation to surviving those conditions. And we know little about their ecology on Delmarva. We're still working on it. We're learning some more stuff, and there's a limited number of studies, especially because they're a little difficult to study because they, unlike catfish, where you just have a ton of them next to the bridge, snakehead you kind of have to target more individually. If you ever go fishing for them, they are like you have to like go into dense vegetation and get them out of there, and it's hard to get them in large quantities and easily study their quantities. But also, we're seeing like we'd see maybe one snakehead, if that, for every 1,000 catfish we've got. And so they're also, in terms of the magnitude of impact on the ecosystem, I don't think they're as big of a impact just because there's a lot fewer of them. That doesn't mean they're not having a negative impact. If they eat a single native species, a single blue crab or a single white perch, that is a negative impact. But again, that has to do with the magnitude of these impacts. We're trying to figure some of these things out. We're not, I don't think we're going to be able to get rid of either them or catfish, but if we have to devote management resources to one or the other, the kind of developing more information will allow us to kind of, if we know blue catfish are a lot worse, then we may just accept snakehead and focus management efforts on blue catfish, things like that. Anyway, they are having a negative impact. The magnitude of their negative impact is still being determined. It could be just very minor to bad in certain situations, especially in new bodies of water where they may not be introduced yet, or areas where they may have like small endangered fishes that could fall prey to the snakehead, things like that. Anyway, they got an air breathing organ right up here, so they can breathe air for up to a day, if maybe a little longer if it's like rainy and not super dry out, it's not super hot. And there's conflicting evidence for terrestrial behaviors at the time I did this study. I remember when the snakeheads came out, were introduced in Maryland in the early 2000s, there would be people on the news being like, they're going to come onto land and eat your puppies and babies, hide your kids, hide your wives. They're going to get everybody out there. And so you got to watch out for these snakeheads. And I remember like early on, there was several terrible, ranging from bad to worse, snakehead horror movies of them coming onto land and eating people. And this is based off of conflicting evidence where there wasn't really scientific evidence. There'd be like somebody dropped it on the ground next to the river and then it wriggled on back in the water. And it's like, it can walk. But there was like a study done 100 years ago that basically described how snakeheads can wiggle over land. And the extent of that, so I have it on the next slide? No. So the extent of that was basically this guy got a bunch of fish from swamplands in Asia, put them on the ground and see, can they move? And this one, and it's like, oh, this one survived an hour and moved a little bit. It can move over land, but did not describe how it moved or anything really useful. It was all vague, and so it wasn't the best study. But I mean, sometimes 100 years ago, scientific standards were different. Basically, if you had the money and resources as an independently wealthy scientist, you could do whatever you want, regardless of animal welfare. But I won't get into that tangent. There is interesting a 1959 Walt Disney original cartoon on snakeheads, kind of a handwritten cartoon that had a better description of how snakeheads moved over land than that one. I think it went something like, it was 2 panels and went, vicious and voracious, the Asiatic snakehead, a true fish, does not abide by its own, or succumb to its own greed of eating everything in the pond. It will simply wriggle over land to the next pond to continue devouring more. And that was the whole description of their behavior. So not very helpful. So I want to separate fact and fiction. Flash forward a little over a decade since they're introduced in Maryland. And when I was getting around to my PhD, I realized still nobody's figured out if they can really move over land or not. So let's figure that out. First, let's see if they can even go onto land, if they even want to go onto land. So I got a bunch of shoe boxes with all these ramps that I put in there, filled them with water with the help of Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and got a bunch of snakehead fry. We chose fry because it's easier to house a fish individually this big than to get 300 containers for like 10-pound snakeheads. So we used a little fry in experiments, and we exposed them to a bunch of treatments that we know cause other amphibious fishes to leave the water, as well as some that we thought may cause them to leave the water, like all these different treatments. And overall, we found that, yes, some conditions will cause them to leave the water. Some things like too salty of water will cause them to come out of the water. You can see a little cute little guy poking his head out of the water there. So too salty of water, which could happen here on the eastern shore. Maybe you got a big storm surge, splashes over into rivers, things like that. As sea levels rise, you may have more saltwater intrusion into marshland and things like that, and like Blackwater. So that is possible for them to experience saltwater. And low pH and high dissolved carbon dioxide, that's generally associated with a lot of decomposing vegetation. You ever gone fishing for snakeheads? You know they love being around a lot of vegetation. And so these are conditions that they will realistically experience. And we showed that they will actually voluntarily come out of land, come out of water under those conditions. Now, some of these other conditions I showed before, they may still work. We only tested them in a limited duration with a limited number of fish. But the goal was to confirm. Oh yeah, and here's somebody showed me a photo of a snakehead they actually saw on a lily pad out fishing, which is cool. And so overall, yeah, we know they will go onto land. We confirmed, yes, they will voluntarily go onto land under their own free will. You maybe just have to coerce them a little bit, but they will. But can they move effectively over land now? If you put something on the ground, doesn't mean it can move around on the ground. It just means you put something on the ground. And if so, how do they move? So you can see here, they do a crawl-like behavior using their head, their axial body, so their main body, and their tail. And they use their pectoral fins as well. So you can see it's not making record-breaking speed over here. But if you put them on a more three-dimensional ground where they can get some more grip and push off of things instead of slipping around like this one, they can actually move pretty quickly. This one's moving, I would say maybe half a mile per hour or something like that, maybe a mile per hour, which it's not very fast for a car or a person, but for a fish, that's pretty good. That's one of the fastest fish on land. And we did some studies, they can move around on a variety of different substrates, a lot of different ground types. And so basically, the rougher the ground, the better they can move. And they can actually move quite well in kind of an army-like, crawl-like behavior. And I did some recorded from their muscles and found out they're not simply just trying to swim on land. Their muscles are activating in a different pattern that suggests they are actively trying to do a crawl over land. And so recently, something I've been interested in after my postdoc was mucus, had the hagfish slime, all this fish mucus and slime. And I was wondering, most amphibious fishes are really small. Snakeheads are a lot bigger. Most of them are like these mummy chubs, like the size of my arm. And those ones, it's hard to measure forces in there. But when you have a big snakehead, you don't need a sensitive equipment. You can use a little force meter grab from one of the physics teaching labs that can record force. I wondered, does slime help them move more easily over land? Because snakeheads are known to be quite slimy as fish go. I've handled them. They're up there in the slimy fish. Maybe not as slimy as American eels, but American eels actually can move over land quite well too. So again, that may support this. So we want to see, does slime help them move over land? And we found that if you wipe, so this is, we found that yes, it helps them move over land. Yellow is with the slime intact. Red is with the slime wiped off. And the y-axis is the static friction coefficient. Basically means the force of friction. So if you have the mucus, you have very low friction. If you take away mucus, you have a lot more friction. So it makes sense. The mucus does help snakeheads move over land. But we compared them to some fully aquatic fish like common carp and blue catfish. And you can see that with the mucus intact, those are still less slippery than the snakeheads. So snakeheads have actually adapted mucus that is more slippery than fully aquatic fish, suggesting they have an adaptation to help them be more slippery and move more easily over land. And actually, this study is just about to be published with an undergraduate from Salisbury University as the lead author who did most of that research. If you know anybody who's looking for programs, Salisbury University gave a small grant to the student to fund a guided snakehead kayak fishing trip out of Blackwater to collect data for his experiments, and he picked up a new hobby while doing it and had a blast. So sometimes science can be fun, and if it's not fun, you're doing the wrong science. And so, 1 second, I gotta wipe my nose. Oh, pressing every button. So now, getting towards the end, don't worry. And so something kind of currently out of my lab is, you can see kind of a little gory here. Last summer, we tried to figure out if snakeheads could breathe air. I did some work on the sensory biology of amphibious fishes, trying to understand how they find their way around on land with senses adapted for water. And I've seen some evidence in walking catfish that they can use chemicals like taste and smell to find their way around the land, but it's all behavioral. Like we don't know for sure. And so with a visiting graduate student from the University of Oklahoma, we put electrodes into basically the nostrils of snakeheads. We had anesthesia water running through over their gills to keep them sedated while they were alive. And we exposed a variety of chemicals to their nostril. And you can see the spike right here means that the snakehead is able to detect that chemical through in the air. This was ammonia, which is a very noxious chemical. I mean, you probably may have smelled ammonia through cleaning supplies stuff. It's very strong and noxious. And so we're trying to learn more about, is this an ancestral condition? Like, is everything able to smell ammonia out of the water? Because it didn't respond to many other chemicals we expose them to in the air. And so this is kind of a complicated thing. We're gonna have to really dissect this and analyze the data really carefully and compare it to, we're comparing it to a fully aquatic fish, a bluegill sunfish, and to an even more amphibious fish, mud skippers. And we're gonna see if we can learn more about how smell works in fishes. As walking catfish, some work I've done shown that they may be able to detect good quality water and versus bad quality water, leave their pond and search for up to like a half a mile away, find a nearby pond or river that may have better quality water, while also moving away from bad quality water, such as ones filled with hydrogen sulfide and rotting vegetation. So we're kind of still figuring this stuff out. So while we're trying to figure that stuff out, do we just sit and wait for results and wait until we have every single answer for every single possible question? No, because then the issue with invasive species will just get worse. But we have some solutions. And the big one is go out and go fishing. Raise your hand if you like fishing. Oh, I feel you. Yeah, you're on the Eastern Shore, you like fishing. Go out, target blue catfish and snakeheads. Particularly the blue catfish, their population's a lot higher. They are tasty. They are not like your typical catfish. They are not a muddy bottom feeder, especially if you get rid of the red muscle, the bloodline, get rid of that red meat. They're going to taste delicious because, again, these aren't your muddy bottom feeder catfish. These are eating things like crabs, striped bass, white perch, ducks, things that we find taste good. That helps make this specific species of catfish taste good. And in fact, this is a species that's farmed in southern catfish farms a lot, and so it's readily on the market. Marylanders just grew up eating rockfish. We didn't grew up eating catfish here. It's a cultural shift, but they are tasty fish, and so we just got to encourage more people to go fishing for them. Order them off menus if you don't like to go fishing, where you can support the watermen that do catch these fish, and we even host our annual Nanticoke River Invasive Fishing Derby in the last 2 weeks of July, when there's the striped bass summer moratorium, when people don't have anything to go fishing for. We're like, how about you try this? It's a free fishing tournament. Usually, I'm still sorting out the funding this year, but it should hopefully work out. But we get funding so that it's free for everybody. We had hundreds of participants last year, the year before. Congressmen were here, a bunch of people, like Fish Talk magazine was coming there. A bunch of people were participating in it, which is good. We want to get the goal of it is to get a lot of attention. But at this event too, we had angling instructors. If you've never gone fishing before, we had gear you could borrow. There was a license-free fishing area at that park, in Cherry Beach Park in Sharptown, Maryland. So you could borrow equipment, learn from an expert, and fish legally. Learn how to catch these fish that you can go back and fill your freezer, catch as many as you want to feed your family. And it's quite successful. And we got a lot of new people into fishing that have never gone fishing before and never thought about going fishing before because of the barriers, like maybe not knowing anybody that goes fishing. Then you're not going to ever get a chance to go fishing. And so it's quite successful. And that's inspired some other invasive species fishing tournaments on the Pocomoke and Wicomico rivers and the Marshy Hope Creek. And so that's good that we're seeing more of these tournaments, encouraging more people to go out and catch these fish. And again, you can always buy them from the menu if you don't like fishing yourself. Go eat fresh seafood. Local, you can't get more fresh and local and sustainably caught blue catfish from just a mile down that way or things like that. And so we got to be their predators. They lack natural predators. Maybe a bald eagle will eat a small one here and there. We did see some cannibalism where larger ones eat some small ones, but they don't really have a massive predator consuming their whole population. So we got to go out, be their predators, eat Chesapeake Bay blue catfish. I think this is was it Governor Westmore did a video showing his favorite taco recipe for blue catfish. They make great fish tacos. They are I would say a firm white fish. They're not as firm as, let's say, rockfish or some other stuff. And so preparing them in a kind of a dry batter, kind of dusting them in corn flour works really well. But you can bake them too. Bake them with pesto on there. Fry them in breadcrumbs. Fried catfish is a staple of down south. You can make them into I've had kind of fish cakes like them, similar to crab cakes, and they're quite tasty. And so go out, be their predators. And kind of one last side note, I'll just kind of show something. I am also a scientific artist. With some of the fish I study, I like to do an artistic process called clearing and staining. I take a whole fish specimen and I treat them with a series of chemicals. Some stain certain tissues, certain colors, like bone gets stained red, cartilage gets stained blue. This is kind of the color over here and here are the natural color. And then sometimes, I'll dissolve everything else away. And then sometimes I'll photograph them and Photoshop them and change the colors around to do these funky effects. So I think it's a fun way to highlight fish anatomy, get people thinking about fish in places that they don't normally think about fish. One of my places I probably usually display my artwork most frequently are breweries, where you can reach average people about fish, and it's a fun conversation starter. Like, what are you doing with that? How do you get that photo? Well, then I have to explain that whole scientific process about that. Then I'll give them a lesson about like striped bass here, or bluefish here, summer flounder, sea robins, white perch, little skates, sculpins, cutlass fish, seahorses. I can give them a lesson about all those fish, but you get somebody's attention with it. And so I just like sharing my artwork. I actually recently got that skate right there tattooed on my arm right here, like the white perch, and I got that tattooed on the inside of my other arm. I like my artwork. I love seeing it every day. I'm never gonna get tired of it, so it's fun. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions. And if you know anybody's interested in graduate programs or undergraduate at Salisbury University, happy to talk more.
Thank you very much.
We got a question.
All right. Many of you have been with me for programs before, but the rules of the road are I'm looking at a lot of people, and I also have people who are online. So if you're in the room and you have a question, raise your hand and I'll come to you with the microphone so that everybody can hear and participate. If you are on Zoom and you have a question, then you can mark the little question box, and our moderator will raise her hand and she will ask her a question for you. I've got a question here.
First, I want to say you're an invaluable resource to the state of Maryland with your knowledge and all of your study, particularly at this time with these fish. Early on in your presentation, you were discussing about non-native species that had been introduced to the area 100, 200 years ago. And my question is, I have a work boat, and I was running crab pots out here at the mouth of the Eastern Bay. Noticed that a lot of blue catfish were at the mouth of the Eastern Bay, but have not really moved so much into the Miles River yet. We have a lot on our creek. We have a big spawn of white perch, a lot of crab, but really no blue catfish yet. A friend of mine that I fish with sometimes, we go out, there's a lot of blue catfish at the mouth of the Magathie. Do you anticipate those fish moving farther into the river over time? And the other question is, do you think snakeheads, I'm sorry, we caught snakeheads down at Blackwater, but do you anticipate that they will also adapt and move into this area at some point?
First, thanks for the kind words. Second, I'll start with the catfish and then the snakehead aspect. So catfish, there's still a lot more we're learning about them. I'm at a primarily undergraduate institution, mostly a teaching university. So I do a lot more research than I'm supposed to be doing. And so I was actually on a call with the head of USGS yesterday, trying to get some more support to get more people out to investigate more things, particularly on the Eastern Shore. A lot more attention is paid to the Western Shore and on this stuff. I'm pretty much the only one doing research on the Eastern Shore. I am the only one doing research on the Eastern Shore on blue catfish, other than my collaborators on these projects with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, who help out with these projects. And they help provide resources. Their resources limited in of themselves. So I'm trying to get more resources and perhaps people and funding to help monitor on the Eastern Shore where there's a lot of watermen, a lot of people go fishing. There's a lot of valuable ecosystems that we need to understand better. And so I don't quite know what's happening in that situation right now, but I imagine the blue catfish will make their way throughout that river. We do see some seasonal shifts in populations in blue catfish, where like in colder weather, they will move maybe colder weather, maybe they'll move further into deeper water, kind of bigger drop-offs. In higher salinity events, they may move further up rivers to get into fresher water where they can tolerate salt water. Just because you tolerate something doesn't mean you like something. So they can tolerate that salt water, but they'll try to move upwards in there. And so it may be just maybe a seasonal abundance you're seeing at the mouth of the river. Or perhaps that's where a lot of the prey is. If a lot of white perch are there and not further upriver, then the blue catfish may be staying around there eating the prey. So there's a lot of factors that can be influencing it, but I do suspect the blue catfish will be in all rivers in the Chesapeake Bay, if they aren't already. However, the 70% abundance, 70% biomass is in certain rivers in certain portions. Some rivers are getting hit harder than others for factors we're still trying to figure out, and may have to do with the water quality, the species that are there, the water usage, how much pollution's in those rivers, how much agriculture is around there, how much urban development is there. So there's a lot of complicated factors, but we're working on trying to understand how they spread out better. But I do see like very high up in rivers and like narrow water, we don't usually see blue catfish like in small little creeks. We see them more in kind of the main stem rivers. So yeah, maybe you will likely still like eventually find them in the smallest part of that creek as you go farthest back at the very beginning of that river, but you're not likely going to find them as abundant as you would down in the main stem. With snakeheads, I do suspect they will also be introduced pretty much throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Their population is still expanding everywhere. People intentionally are catching them and putting them in their, people like catching them. It makes it complicated for management. While we're still trying to figure out how bad their impacts are, whether it's tolerable or like where it's like, yeah, okay, it reduces, there's some studies in certain bodies of water that it reduces the largemouth bass population by 4%. So that is a negative impact, but it's 4%, like all things considered, that's not terrible if they also provide additional recreation opportunities. But we do know in some areas that they are having big impacts on the native killifish populations, like the mummy chugs, the things that they eat, because these killifish specialize in living in dense vegetation, like right on shorelines, and that's where snakeheads like to be. And so they may have more specific impacts than the blue catfish. But while we're trying to figure that out, some people who just really like catching them, kind of ignoring all those factors, will be like, my favorite snakehead spot's too far away from me. I'm gonna go catch some snakeheads and put it in the pond next to me, and they can spread through there. So that's how a lot of it has actually happened. And so while some of the first snakehead introductions were thought to be from one instance was directly tied to a ritual release. Somebody got them at a live fish market for food, considering they taste really good. And they breathe air, so you can keep them alive in a bucket of water for a while. It makes them a good, ideal fish to keep fresh at a fish market. And so a story goes, a guy from East Asian descent went and got the catfish and to make a medicinal stew for his sister to get better. She ended up getting better before he made the stew, and so for good luck, he released those two fish back in the wild. That's thought to be the introduction in Crofton Pond, Maryland. And I mean, he didn't know better. I think we just got to improve ecology education in all the schools and all that stuff, and then we'll have less instances of people letting their goldfishes and things like that out. But he didn't know. But there's other instances of people used to have snakeheads as pets, and it seems like genetically, and they may have let them go when they got too big. And then genetically, there have been multiple introductions. So it seems people are introducing them in more areas. So it may not even be that they're spreading on their own. It's just people are adding them into more different areas, which makes it harder to figure out, are they spreading over land? Are they spreading from introductions? One instance I think they do know they spread over land is when they were first found in Maryland. A guy was farming them in Arkansas to sell, and he was told that he's no longer be able to do that because they're now going to be listed as invasive species. And so he's like, all right, I'll kill him. He drained his ponds, threw him on the riverbank, and he's like, my job is done. And the story goes that I think his pond was a couple 100 feet away from a creek that fed into the Arkansas River, that fed into the Mississippi River. A couple of years later, you found them in the Arkansas River. A couple of years after that, they're now in the Mississippi River. So they're still spreading throughout the whole country. They just got into the Mississippi River in a very small portion in Arkansas. Mississippi's connected to a lot of waterways, so you're going to see them all over the country soon, and that's just going to be a reality. And we just got to study. We need more resources to study these issues more to understand how they're going to affect all these different ecosystems throughout the country differently, and even within in the state of Maryland, each river is different.
We've got a question online. In the Northern Bay, it seems very difficult to find either of the fish to purchase in the stores. When I can get them, yes, they're delicious, but my local fish stores rarely seem to have any. With the snakeheads, they're selling them as Chesapeake Kana in order to avoid the stigma of the name snakehead. And I think I pronounced that incorrectly.
Yep.
Chesapeake
So Chesapeake
Chana.
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 Yeah.
Right.
So I guess this is just starting the snakehead. So Chesapeake Chana is, so the scientific name for snakehead is Chana argus. And so there was a recent bill that passed in the Maryland State Legislature to officially rename Northern Snakehead Chesapeake Chana, at least for the purpose of marketing. Now, no fisherman's going to be like, I caught a Chesapeake Chana, other than as a joke. Right now, I mean that's the kind of consensus I've seen in anglers right now, at least early on. But what this allows is for seafood companies, fish restaurants, things like that, to be able to serve something that isn't called snakehead. Because words have power. People see a snakehead on the menu, they've never seen it, like, oh, gross. Like, we associate snakes with gross things, and snakehead is like, oh, gross. That sounds unappetizing. And so they named it Chesapeake Chana, so that based off its scientific name, it's not an accurate name. Chesapeake kind of lows, oh, but this Chesapeake Chana, tell me more about this locally caught fish that's fresh from our native waterways. It's the power of names, I mean, and the power of culture in there. I like to talk people into eating snakeheads and catfish by kind of saying they may look ugly, but do you ever go, oh, first, do you think crabs look particularly delicious? Flounders look particularly delicious? Do you go up to a cow and go, dang, that's an attractive looking animal, I want to put that in my mouth? No, it's meat. Once you take the skin off, it's meat. It's just meat is meat. And so if we get the names away from it, then that can help selling it. And so the Chesapeake Chana is a way to help make it more marketable. However, specifically with snakehead and Chesapeake Chana, it is very difficult fishery to do because they live in dense vegetation and they're kind of solitary. So you can't catch a big school with them. You can't long line or bottom trawl or whatever for them. You have to kind of target them one by one, either hook and line or bow fishing. And so that leads to kind of more of a small scale fishery. There are some grants by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources that's been giving out to people to develop more avenues for making a larger scale fishery. But given it is difficult to catch in bulk, it's not going to be as widespread available and as predictably available, particularly in like winter and stuff like that, when the snakeheads kind of bury into the mud and kind of go dormant for winter. And so you're not going to find that. Catfish should be more readily available around on the market. It's still, there's some issues with the catfish processing laws and catfish processing output that may limit the ability to get catfish on the market, but I'm working with legislature to get around some of that. We're recently in the Farm Bill, we got funding for a $3 million exclusive blue catfish processing plant on the Eastern Shore that should actually probably developed kind of nearby here somewhere. Yeah, right over here. And so it's going to be, so that's going to be here, and once that's out, that's going to dramatically increase the ability to fish processors to increase the output of blue catfish in the market. And then that'll mean that with more processing plants, there'll be more watermen can, basically you could fill up a fish processor very quickly and they'll be like, sorry, we don't have any more room to handle blue catfish. But if you have another big facility just devoted to that, it helps get more catfish on the market, which will help make it more readily available, which will help more people develop a taste for it, which will mean more people want to buy it, which will mean more people will to support more watermen doing it. And so we're working on getting that off the ground. So snakehead is always going to be kind of difficult to find in the market, but blue catfish, we're hoping it can get more and more readily available on the market.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Noah, thank you so much. This was such an informative evening and I think really helped to
No problem.
definitely helped to address one of the topics that I know a lot of people ask about and talk about. I know we've got a lot of volunteers and community members here who are thinking about this. So please go out and share, and a plug if you haven't seen, there's a great film on that MPT has on eating blue catfish,
Yeah,
right?
then
Or eating
PBS, Maryland
invasives.
Public Broadcasting.
Yep.
We were in that documentary kind of on the whole issue. So I highly recommend it.
Yep.
It's like a 25-minute little documentary.
Thank you, everybody. I hope to see you not this Saturday, but next Saturday here, same place, but different time. Have a great evening.